There is a moment that almost everyone has experienced. You are lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and a problem is circling through your mind. It replays itself over and over. You see what went wrong. You feel the weight of what might go wrong next. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts accelerate. And the more you try to think your way out of it, the deeper you seem to sink into the very thing you are trying to escape. You are not lazy. You are not weak. You are simply caught in a pattern that the human mind falls into more easily than most people realize. And understanding that pattern is the first step toward changing it. Every person listening to this right now has problems. That is not a guess. That is a certainty. Problems are woven into the fabric of being alive. They come in different shapes. Some are small and nagging, like a persistent leak you keep meaning to fix. Some are enormous and disorienting, like losing a job, ending a relationship, or facing a health crisis that redefines your entire sense of what is possible. Problems do not discriminate. They arrive at the doors of the ambitious and the cautious alike. They visit the wealthy and the struggling. They interrupt plans and unsettle even the most carefully constructed lives. And yet, if you look closely at the people around you, you will notice something interesting. Two people can face nearly identical problems and respond in entirely different ways. One person becomes consumed by the difficulty. They replay it, analyze it, worry about it, talk about it endlessly, and yet somehow never seem to move through it. The other person feels the weight of the same challenge, perhaps even more deeply, but begins to orient themselves differently. They ask different questions. They take different steps, and slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, they start to move forward. This difference is not about intelligence. It is not about talent or luck, or having access to resources that others do not. It is about the direction of focus. It is about where the mind points itself in the presence of difficulty. And that direction, more than almost anything else, determines what happens next. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity for focus. It can zoom in on a single detail with astonishing precision. It can hold complex ideas, weigh competing possibilities, and imagine futures that do not yet exist. But this same power of focus can become a trap when it locks onto the wrong target. When the mind fixes itself on a problem, truly fixes itself there, it begins to see the problem everywhere. It magnifies it. It connects it to other problems. It builds a narrative in which the problem is not just a difficulty to be addressed, but an identity to be lived. And once that happens, the problem is no longer something in front of you. It becomes something inside you. It becomes the lens through which you interpret everything. This audiobook is about learning to redirect that lens, not by pretending problems do not exist, not by forcing a smile or repeating affirmations that feel hollow, but by learning, through understanding and practice, how to shift the direction of your thinking so that you spend less time trapped in the problem and more time moving toward what can be done about it. This is not a book about positive thinking. Positive thinking, in its simplest form, can be dangerously naive. Telling someone to just look on the bright side when they are facing genuine hardship is not only unhelpful, it can feel dismissive. This is not that. This is about strategic thinking. It is about learning how the mind works, understanding why it gets stuck, and developing the skill of redirecting your attention toward the things that actually move your life forward. Because here is something worth sitting with. The most effective people you have ever admired, the ones who seem to navigate difficulty with a kind of steady grace, are not people who live without problems. They are people who have learned to think differently in the presence of problems. They have trained their minds, sometimes consciously, and sometimes through sheer necessity, to ask a different set of questions. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" they ask, "What can I do about this right now?" Instead of asking, "Whose fault is this?" they ask, "What is the next step I can take?" And that shift, that simple but profound redirection of mental energy, changes everything. It changes how they feel, it changes what they see, and it changes what they do. Over the next 2 hours, you and I are going to walk through this shift together. We are going to explore how the mind reacts to problems, why it tends to get stuck, and what you can do to begin moving in a different direction. We are going to talk about emotions, about uncertainty, about the stories you tell yourself when things go wrong. And we are going to build, piece by piece, a way of thinking that does not eliminate difficulty, but allows you to face it with greater clarity, greater calm, and greater confidence. This is not about becoming someone who never struggles. It is about becoming someone who struggles forward. So let us begin where all real understanding begins. Let us look at how the mind works when it encounters a problem, and why it so often keeps us stuck in the very thing we are trying to solve. The human brain is, in many ways, an ancient machine running in a modern world. It was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years by environments that looked nothing like the one you live in today. For most of human history, survival depended on one thing above all else: the ability to detect and respond to threats. A rustle in the grass might be the wind, or it might be a predator. The individuals who survived were the ones who assumed the worst and reacted accordingly. They were the ones who paid more attention to danger than to beauty, more attention to what could go wrong than to what was going right. This tendency, this bias toward threat detection, was a gift from evolution. It kept your ancestors alive, but in the modern world, it creates a problem of its own. You are no longer scanning the savannah for predators, but your brain still operates as though you are. When you encounter a challenge, whether it is a conflict at work, a financial setback, or an uncertain future, your brain responds with the same urgency it would have brought to a physical threat. It narrows your focus. It increases your vigilance. It floods your body with stress hormones designed to help you fight or flee. And while this response is useful when you are facing genuine physical danger, it is far less useful when you are trying to think clearly about a complex personal or professional challenge. In fact, it often makes things worse. This is what psychologists sometimes refer to as the negativity bias. It is the brain's built-in tendency to give more weight to negative experiences than to positive ones. Studies have shown that negative events are processed more thoroughly than positive ones. They are stored more vividly in memory. They influence decision-making more powerfully, and they capture attention more quickly. This is why a single piece of criticism can overshadow a dozen compliments. It is why a single bad experience at a restaurant can outweigh years of good ones. And it is why, when you are facing a problem, your mind has a natural pull toward dwelling on what is wrong rather than exploring what might be done. But the negativity bias is only part of the picture. There is another pattern that compounds the problem, and it is one that most people recognize the moment it is described. It is called rumination. Rumination is the act of thinking about the same problem over and over again without making progress toward a solution. It is the mental equivalent of spinning your wheels in mud. You are expending enormous energy, but you are not going anywhere. And the cruel irony of rumination is that it often disguises itself as productive thinking. You feel like you are working on the problem. You feel like if you just think about it a little more, a little harder, a little longer, you will arrive at some insight or solution. But rumination is not problem solving. It is problem rehearsing. It is replaying the difficulty, experiencing the emotions, and reinforcing the very neural pathways that keep you stuck. Rumination is closely tied to another cognitive pattern that deserves attention, and that is the tendency toward catastrophic thinking. When you are caught in a problem-focused mindset, the mind does not simply assess the current difficulty. It projects forward. It imagines the worst possible outcomes. It builds elaborate scenarios in which the problem grows, spreads, and becomes unmanageable. A missed deadline becomes a lost job. A disagreement becomes a ruined relationship. A financial setback becomes a life of poverty. These projections feel real in the moment. They carry emotional weight. But they are, more often than not, distortions. They are the mind's threat detection system running unchecked, constructing futures that have not happened and may never happen. And then there is the emotional dimension. When you are stuck in a problem-focused mindset, the emotions that arise are almost always unpleasant: fear, frustration, helplessness, anger, shame. These emotions are not just uncomfortable. They are functionally narrowing. Research in psychology has shown that negative emotions tend to constrict the range of thoughts and actions that come to mind. When you are afraid, you think about escape. When you are angry, you think about retaliation. When you are overwhelmed, you think about nothing at all. The emotional experience of being stuck in a problem literally reduces your ability to think creatively about solutions. It is a vicious cycle. The problem triggers negative emotions. The negative emotions narrow your thinking. The narrow thinking keeps you focused on the problem, and the continued focus on the problem generates more negative emotions. There is also something subtler at work, something that operates below the level of conscious awareness. When a problem persists, many people begin to build an identity around it. The problem becomes part of who they are. They become the person who was wronged, the person who was unlucky, the person who always struggles. This is not a conscious choice. It happens gradually, through repeated thought and conversation. But once a problem becomes part of your identity, solving it can feel strangely threatening, because solving it would mean letting go of the story you have been telling yourself. It would mean redefining who you are. And for many people, the familiarity of the problem, even with all its pain, feels safer than the uncertainty of life without it. Understanding these patterns is not meant to make you feel worse about yourself. Quite the opposite. It is meant to help you see that when you feel stuck, it is not because you are broken or incapable. It is because your mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is scanning for threats, amplifying negative signals, and narrowing your focus to the perceived danger. The problem is not that your brain is malfunctioning. The problem is that your brain's default settings are not well suited to the kind of complex, nuanced challenges that modern life presents. But here is the good news. While you cannot override these default settings entirely, you can learn to work with them. You can learn to notice when you have fallen into rumination and gently redirect your attention. You can learn to recognize catastrophic thinking and question it. You can learn to manage the emotions that narrow your thinking and create space for broader, more creative responses. None of this happens overnight, but it happens. And it begins with the simple awareness that the way you are currently thinking about a problem may not be the only way to think about it. The mind is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an active constructor of experience. Two people can look at the same situation and see entirely different things, not because the situation is different, but because their minds are filtering, interpreting, and framing it differently. And if the mind is constructing your experience, then it follows that by learning to direct the mind differently, you can begin to construct a different experience. Not a fantasy, not a denial, but a more useful, more accurate, and more empowering way of seeing what is in front of you. That is the shift we are working toward. And to understand it more deeply, it helps to see what it looks like when someone is caught on the other side of it. When the problem becomes the only thing they can see. Let me tell you about a man we will call David. David was 43 years old when the company he had worked at for nearly 15 years announced a round of layoffs. He had known it was coming. There had been rumors for months, whispered conversations in hallways, a noticeable tension in meetings that used to feel routine. But knowing something might happen and actually experiencing it are two very different things. When David's manager called him into the office on a Tuesday morning and told him that his position was being eliminated, the words landed like a physical blow. He sat very still. He nodded. He shook the man's hand. And then he walked to his car in the parking garage and sat behind the wheel for nearly an hour, staring at nothing. In the days that followed, David did what many people do. He told himself he was fine. He updated his resume. He scrolled through job listings. But underneath the surface activity, something else was happening. His mind was locked in a loop. He replayed the conversation with his manager over and over. He thought about all the years he had given to that company. He thought about the projects he had led, the late nights, the weekends he had sacrificed. And he thought about how none of it had mattered. That was the phrase that kept surfacing. None of it mattered. David's wife noticed the change before he did. He was quieter at dinner. He was short with the kids. He would sit at his computer for hours, but apply to very few jobs. When she asked how the search was going, he would say it was fine, but his voice carried a flatness that told her otherwise. The truth was, David was not really searching. He was stuck, not in the practical sense, because there were jobs to apply for and people to call and networks to reach out to. He was stuck in his thinking. Every time he sat down to work on his search, his mind pulled him back to the layoff. He thought about the unfairness of it. He thought about a colleague who had been kept on despite, in David's view, contributing far less. He thought about his age and whether anyone would want to hire someone in their 40s when there were younger, cheaper candidates available. These thoughts felt rational to David. They felt like clear-eyed assessments of his situation. But they were not assessments. They were narratives. They were stories his mind was constructing. Stories that had just enough truth in them to feel convincing, but that were ultimately keeping him from doing the very things that might help him move forward. Weeks turned into a month. David began to withdraw from friends. He stopped going to the gym. He stayed up late watching television, not because he enjoyed it, but because it numbed the anxiety that surfaced whenever the house was quiet. His sleep deteriorated. His confidence which had once been one of his defining qualities, eroded slowly but steadily. He began to feel not just unemployed, but unemployable. And the longer he stayed in this state, the harder it became to imagine a way out. What David did not realize, and what most people do not realize when they are in the middle of it, was that the problem he was facing had two layers. The first layer was the actual situation. He had lost his job and needed to find a new one. That was a real, concrete, solvable problem. The second layer was his relationship with the problem, the way he was thinking about it, the stories he was telling himself, the emotions he was generating through constant rumination. And it was this second layer, not the first, that was keeping him stuck. David's thinking had all the hallmarks of the problem-focused mind. He was ruminating, replaying the same painful thoughts without arriving at any new insight. He was catastrophizing, projecting a future in which his career was over and his best years were behind him. He was personalizing, interpreting the layoff as a reflection of his worth, rather than a business decision driven by forces beyond his control. And he was filtering, focusing exclusively on the negative aspects of his situation, while ignoring the resources, skills, and relationships that were still available to him. None of this was happening because David was foolish or self-indulgent. It was happening because his mind was doing what minds do under threat. It was narrowing. It was protecting. It was scanning for danger and finding it everywhere. But in doing so, it was also closing off the very pathways that might lead to a solution. There was a moment, about 6 weeks after the layoff, that marked a quiet turning point. David was sitting in a coffee shop, pretending to work on his laptop, when he ran into an old friend named Marcus. Marcus had gone through his own career disruption a few years earlier. He had been laid off, started a small consulting business, struggled for a while, and eventually found his footing. They talked for over an hour, and during that conversation, Marcus said something that stayed with David long after they parted ways. Marcus said, "I spent 3 months being angry about what happened to me. And those were 3 months I will never get back, not because the anger was wrong. It was completely understandable, but because while I was busy being angry, I was not busy building anything. And at some point, I had to decide which one I wanted to spend my energy on." David did not have an epiphany in that moment. He did not walk out of the coffee shop transformed. But something shifted, just slightly, in the way he was thinking. For the first time in weeks, he considered the possibility that his focus might be part of the problem. That the hours he was spending replaying the past and fearing the future were not bringing him closer to a solution. They were just burning fuel, and that small, quiet recognition, the recognition that the direction of his thinking might be something he could influence, was the beginning of a different kind of movement. We will return to David later. But for now, let us explore what that movement looks like. Let us talk about what it means to shift from a problem-focused mind to a solution-oriented one, and how that shift actually works in practice. The shift from problem-focused thinking to solution-oriented thinking is not a switch that flips. It is more like a gradual turn of the head. You are not ignoring the problem. You are not pretending it does not exist. You are simply choosing, consciously and deliberately, to spend more of your mental energy on what can be done, rather than on what has already happened. This starts with the questions you ask yourself. When you are stuck in a problem-focused mindset, the questions you tend to ask are backward, looking and often unanswerable. Why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? Why is this so unfair? These questions are not useless in every context. Sometimes understanding why something happened is genuinely important. But when these questions dominate your thinking, they keep you oriented toward the past. They keep you locked in a narrative of blame, regret, or victimhood. And they rarely, if ever, generate forward movement. Solution-oriented thinking begins when you start asking a different kind of question. What can I do about this right now? What is the next small step I can take? What resources do I have available? Who might be able to help? What part of this situation is within my control? These questions are not magic. They do not dissolve the difficulty, but they do something profoundly important. They redirect the mind's attention from what is broken to what is possible. And that redirection, even when it is small, changes the emotional landscape of the experience. It creates a sense of agency. It introduces momentum, and momentum, even tiny amounts of it, has a way of building on itself. One of the most effective strategies for shifting into solution-oriented thinking is what some coaches and therapists call chunking. Chunking is the practice of taking a large, overwhelming problem and breaking it into smaller, more manageable pieces. The reason this works is deeply rooted in how the brain processes challenge. When you face a problem that feels enormous, the brain's threat response activates. You feel overwhelmed, and that sense of overwhelm triggers a kind of mental paralysis. You do not know where to start, so you do not start at all. But when you break the problem into smaller components, each individual piece feels more approachable. Your brain can engage with it without triggering the same level of stress. And as you address one small piece and then another, you begin to build evidence that the problem is not as insurmountable as it seemed. Consider someone who is facing significant debt. The total number can feel crushing. It can trigger shame, fear, and a desire to avoid thinking about it altogether. But if that same person sits down and identifies the smallest debt, just one account with a manageable balance, and focuses their energy on paying that one off, something begins to change. Not just financially, but psychologically. They have done something. They have moved. And that movement, however small, disrupts the cycle of helplessness that was keeping them stuck. Another key element of solution-oriented thinking is the willingness to separate what you can control from what you cannot. This is not a new idea. It has been a cornerstone of practical philosophy for thousands of years. But it remains one of the most powerful mental habits a person can develop. When you spend time and energy worrying about things that are outside your control, you are not only wasting resources, you are also reinforcing a sense of powerlessness. But when you redirect that energy toward the things you can influence, no matter how small they may be, you reclaim a sense of agency. And that sense of agency is one of the most important psychological resources you have. Solution-oriented thinking also requires a certain tolerance for imperfection. People who are stuck in problem-focused thinking often have an unspoken belief that they need to find the perfect solution before they can act. They analyze, deliberate, and weigh options endlessly, not because they are thorough, but because they are afraid of making the wrong choice. This perfectionism masquerades as diligence, but it is really a form of avoidance. Solution-oriented thinkers, by contrast, understand that most problems do not have perfect solutions. They have workable ones, good enough ones. Solutions that move the needle, even if they do not resolve everything at once. And the willingness to pursue a good enough solution To act before all the information is in is often the difference between progress and paralysis. There is also something important to understand about the relationship between thinking and doing. In a problem-focused state, thinking and doing often become disconnected. You think endlessly but do very little. In a solution-oriented state, thinking and doing are more tightly linked. You think about what can be done, and then you do it. You observe the results, adjust your approach, and act again. This cycle of thought, action, observation, and adjustment is the engine of progress. And it only starts when you shift your focus from the problem itself to the question of what you can do about it. None of this means that you should ignore the emotional weight of your problems. In fact, one of the greatest misconceptions about solution-oriented thinking is that it requires you to suppress your feelings. It does not. What it requires is that you do not let your feelings make all of your decisions. You can feel afraid and still take a step forward. You can feel frustrated and still ask a useful question. You can feel uncertain and still make a choice. Solution-oriented thinking is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of direction despite emotion, and that brings us to something that deserves its own careful exploration: the role of emotional control in clear thinking and effective problem solving. Emotions are not the enemy of good decision-making. That is a myth that has persisted for too long, and it has done real harm. Emotions are data. They are signals from your internal environment, telling you something about how you are experiencing a situation. Fear tells you that something feels threatening. Anger tells you that something feels unjust. Sadness tells you that something has been lost. These signals are valuable. They carry information that your conscious mind might overlook. The problem is not that you have emotions. The problem arises when emotions take the wheel entirely, when they become the sole driver of your thoughts and actions, overriding the parts of your mind that are capable of reflection, analysis, and strategic thinking. When you are in the grip of a strong negative emotion, your cognitive capacity is genuinely reduced. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological reality. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning, reasoning, and impulse control, becomes less active when the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, is highly engaged. In simple terms, when your emotional brain is shouting, your thinking brain has a harder time being heard. This is why people say and do things during moments of intense emotion that they later regret. It is not that they are bad people. It is that their capacity for clear thinking was temporarily diminished. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone who wants to develop a solution-oriented mindset. Because if emotional reactivity reduces your ability to think clearly, then learning to manage that reactivity is not a luxury. It is a strategic necessity. It is the foundation upon which better thinking is built. The first step in managing emotional reactivity is awareness. Simply noticing what you are feeling, without immediately acting on it, creates a small but significant gap between stimulus and response. In that gap lies your freedom. You might feel a surge of anger when a colleague dismisses your idea in a meeting. If you react instantly, you might say something you regret. But if you pause, even for a few seconds, and simply name what you are feeling, something shifts. The act of naming an emotion, what psychologists call affect labeling, has been shown to reduce the intensity of the emotion. It moves the experience from the purely emotional part of the brain to the more analytical part. It turns raw feeling into information that can be processed and responded to thoughtfully. This does not mean you should never express strong emotions. There are times when anger is appropriate, when grief needs to be voiced, when frustration needs to be acknowledged. But there is a difference between expressing an emotion and being controlled by one. The goal is not emotional suppression. The goal is emotional regulation, the ability to experience your feelings fully, while still maintaining enough cognitive control to make wise decisions. There are several practical strategies that support emotional regulation, and they are worth understanding not as abstract concepts, but as tools you can use in real situations. One of the most supported is the practice of deliberate breathing. When your stress response is activated, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. This is part of the body's preparation for fight or flight. But the relationship between breathing and stress works in both directions. Just as stress changes your breathing, changing your breathing can reduce stress. Slow, deliberate breaths, particularly those where the exhale is longer than the inhale, activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the body's calming mechanism. This is not a gimmick. It is a direct physiological intervention that quiets the emotional alarm system and allows the thinking brain to re-engage. Another strategy is what might be called temporal distancing. When you are caught in a strong emotional reaction, the problem feels enormous and permanent. But if you ask yourself how you will feel about this in a week, a month, or a year, you introduce perspective. You remind yourself that this moment, however intense, is temporary. This does not diminish the importance of the problem. It simply places it in a larger context, and that context can be enough to reduce the emotional intensity and allow you to think more clearly. There is also the practice of separating the situation from your interpretation of the situation. This is a core principle of cognitive behavioral approaches, and it is remarkably powerful. When something happens, you rarely respond to the event itself. You respond to the story you tell yourself about the event. If a friend cancels plans, you might tell yourself they do not care about you. If a project fails, you might tell yourself you are incompetent. These stories feel like facts, but they are interpretations. And recognizing that they are interpretations, rather than truths, opens the door to telling a different, more useful story. Emotional control also involves understanding the concept of emotional inertia. This is the tendency for your current emotional state to persist even after the triggering event has passed. If you have a stressful morning, the stress does not simply disappear when the morning ends. It carries forward, coloring your afternoon, your interactions, your decisions. Being aware of this tendency allows you to take proactive steps to reset. A short walk, a few minutes of quiet, a conversation with someone who grounds you. These are not indulgences. They are strategic interventions that prevent accumulated stress from degrading the quality of your thinking. One of the most important things to understand about emotional control is that it is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about becoming responsive rather than reactive. A reactive person is at the mercy of their emotions. They act impulsively, make decisions they regret, and burn through relationships and opportunities because they cannot manage their internal state. A responsive person feels the same emotions, sometimes even more intensely, but creates space between what they feel and what they do. In that space, they choose. And that choice, that moment of deliberate, conscious direction, is where solutions are born. When you can manage your emotional state, even imperfectly, You gain access to the full range of your cognitive abilities. You can think more broadly. You can consider more options. You can evaluate consequences more clearly. And you can act with greater precision and purpose. Emotional control does not make problems disappear, but it makes you a far more effective problem solver. And in a world where problems are inevitable, being an effective problem solver is one of the most valuable things you can be. This brings us to another essential element of solution-oriented thinking, one that trips up even the most capable and intelligent people. It is the challenge of taking action when the path forward is not entirely clear. There is a particular kind of paralysis that afflicts thoughtful people. It is not the paralysis of laziness or indifference. It is the paralysis of wanting to make the right decision so badly that you end up making no decision at all. You gather information, you weigh options, you consult others, you think and think and think, and meanwhile, time passes, the situation evolves, and the window for action narrows. This is one of the most common and most costly patterns in human decision-making, the belief that you need perfect clarity before you can act. The truth is, perfect clarity almost never arrives, certainly not in advance of action. Life is inherently uncertain. The future is, by definition, unknowable. And waiting for a guarantee that your next step is the right one is like waiting for the weather to promise it will never rain. You can wait forever, and you will still get wet eventually. Solution-oriented thinkers understand something: that problem-focused thinkers often miss clarity is frequently the result of action, not the prerequisite for it. You do not figure out the path by standing at the trailhead studying the map. You figure it out by walking. Each step you take gives you new information. It shows you what works and what does not. It reveals obstacles you did not anticipate and opportunities you could not have seen from where you were standing. And with each step, the path becomes a little clearer, not because the terrain has changed, but because your perspective has. This does not mean you should act recklessly. There is a difference between taking thoughtful action in the face of uncertainty and being impulsive. Thoughtful action involves making the best decision you can with the information you have, taking a step, observing the results, and adjusting. Impulsivity involves acting without thinking at all. The distinction matters, but for most people, the greater risk is not impulsivity. It is inaction. It is waiting so long for certainty that the moment passes, the opportunity dissolves, and the problem deepens. One of the most useful concepts in navigating uncertainty is the idea of reversible versus irreversible decisions. Many of the decisions that paralyze people are, in fact, reversible. You can take a job and leave it if it is not right. You can try an approach and change course if it does not work. You can have a conversation and clarify your position if it is misunderstood. These are not permanent, life-altering commitments. They are experiments, and treating them as experiments rather than as final verdicts reduces the emotional weight of making them. Irreversible decisions deserve more caution, more thought, more deliberation. But even with irreversible decisions, there comes a point where additional deliberation yields diminishing returns. You have gathered the relevant information. You have consulted the people who matter. You have sat with the decision long enough to distinguish between genuine insight and anxious noise. And now it is time to choose, not because you are certain, but because choosing, even imperfectly, moves you forward, and moving forward is the only way to generate the new information and new experiences that will guide your next choice. There is a concept in engineering called the minimum viable product. It is the simplest version of something that can be built and tested. The idea is not to create something perfect. It is to create something functional enough to generate feedback. That feedback then guides the next iteration. This concept applies far beyond engineering. It applies to careers, relationships, personal goals, and virtually every other domain of life. Instead of trying to build the perfect plan, build a good enough plan. Execute it, learn from it, and improve. Taking action despite uncertainty also builds a psychological resource that is difficult to develop any other way. Confidence. Confidence does not come from knowing everything. It comes from knowing that you can handle what comes, and you only develop that knowledge by testing yourself. Every time you take a step into the unknown and navigate whatever you find there, you lay down another layer of evidence that you are capable. Over time, these layers accumulate. They form a foundation that supports bolder action and clearer thinking in the face of increasingly complex challenges. There is also something worth saying about the relationship between action and anxiety. Anxiety thrives in the space between a problem and a response. When you know something needs to be done, but you are not doing it, anxiety fills the gap. It grows in proportion to the size of the gap and the length of time it persists. But when you take action, even small action, the anxiety begins to diminish, not because the problem is solved, but because you are no longer passively enduring it. You are actively engaging with it, and that shift from passive to active is one of the most powerful anxiety-reducing mechanisms available to you. Consider someone who has been putting off a difficult conversation. Every day they avoid it. The anxiety grows. They imagine how the other person will react. They rehearse worst-case scenarios. They feel a growing dread that colors their entire day. But when they finally have the conversation, even if it is uncomfortable, the relief is almost immediate. Not because the conversation went perfectly, but because the gap between knowing and doing has been closed. The uncertainty has been replaced by information, even if that information is not what they hoped for. This is the paradox of action in the face of uncertainty. It feels risky. It feels dangerous. Every part of your threat detection system screams at you to wait, to gather more information, to be more careful. But the risk of inaction is almost always greater. Because inaction does not preserve the status quo. It allows the situation to evolve without your input. It cedes control to circumstances. And it erodes the very confidence and agency you need to navigate what comes next. So when you find yourself paralyzed by uncertainty, ask yourself this: what is the smallest step I can take right now that would move me even slightly forward? It does not have to be the perfect step. It does not have to solve everything. It just has to be movement. Because movement, even imperfect movement, creates information. And information creates clarity, and clarity creates the conditions for better, bolder action. This leads us naturally to another powerful tool in the solution-oriented thinker's repertoire, the ability to reframe how challenges are experienced and understood. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, about two shoe salesmen sent to a remote region where no one wore shoes. One sent back a message saying there is no market here, nobody wears shoes. The other sent a message saying there is enormous opportunity here, nobody wears shoes yet. The situation was identical. The interpretation was entirely different. And the interpretation determined what happened next. This is the essence of reframing. It is the ability to look at a situation from a different angle and, In doing so, change your emotional and strategic response to it. Reframing is not about denying reality. It is not about putting a positive spin on something genuinely terrible. It is about recognizing that most situations can be interpreted in multiple ways, and that the interpretation you choose has a direct impact on how you feel and what you do. Consider failure. Most people experience failure as a verdict. They tried something, it did not work, and the failure tells them something about their ability, their worth, or their prospects. But failure can also be interpreted as information. It tells you what does not work, which narrows the field of what might. It tells you where your approach was flawed, which gives you something specific to improve. It tells you that you had the courage to try, which is itself a kind of success that many people never achieve. None of these reframings erase the disappointment of failure, but they transform it from a dead end into a data point. And data points are useful. Dead ends are not. Reframing is not just a cognitive trick. It has measurable effects on emotional experience. Research has consistently shown that cognitive reappraisal, the technical term for reframing, is one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies available. When you reframe a stressful situation as a challenge rather than a threat, your physiological response changes. Your body produces more of the hormones associated with focused engagement and fewer of those associated with helpless distress. You think more clearly, you perform better, and you recover more quickly from the experience. This does not mean that every problem can or should be reframed as an opportunity. Some situations are genuinely terrible, and acknowledging that is important. Losing a loved one is not an opportunity. A serious illness is not a growth experience waiting to be appreciated. There are times when the most honest and healthy response is grief, anger, or simple acknowledgement that something is deeply wrong. Reframing is not about forcing positivity onto pain. It is about finding the most useful and accurate way to think about a situation so that you can respond to it as effectively as possible. One particularly powerful form of reframing involves shifting from a fixed perspective to a temporal one. When you are in the middle of a problem, it can feel permanent. It can feel as though this is how things will always be. But very few problems are truly permanent. Most are phases. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. And reminding yourself that you are in the middle of something, not at the end, can change the way you experience it. The phrase "this is temporary" is not a platitude. It is often the literal truth, and holding that truth in mind can prevent the kind of despair that makes problems feel insurmountable. Another form of reframing involves shifting from a personal perspective to a broader one. When you are struggling, it is easy to feel as though you are the only one, as though everyone else has it figured out and you are uniquely flawed. But this is almost never the case. Most people are dealing with challenges they do not talk about. Most people have moments of doubt, confusion, and struggle that they keep hidden. Knowing this does not solve your problem, but it can reduce the shame and isolation that often accompany it. And when shame and isolation are reduced, you are better able to seek help, share your experience, and connect with others who might offer perspective or support. There is also the reframe of agency. When something goes wrong, it is natural to focus on the aspects of the situation that were outside your control. The economy shifted. The other person acted unfairly. The timing was wrong. And while these factors may be real, focusing exclusively on them creates a sense of helplessness. The reframe is to ask what was within your control, what you might have done differently, and what you can do now. This is not about self-blame. It is about reclaiming a sense of influence. Because even in situations that are largely outside your control, there is almost always some element that you can affect. And focusing on that element, however small, is what keeps you moving. Reframing is a skill that improves with practice. The more you do it, the more naturally it comes. You begin to notice when you are interpreting a situation in the most negative possible way. And you start to ask whether there is a more useful interpretation available. You begin to catch yourself in catastrophic thinking and introduce a more balanced perspective. You begin to see problems not as evidence that life is against you, but as puzzles that require your engagement and creativity. And as this way of thinking becomes more habitual, you find that the emotional weight of problems begins to lighten, not because the problems have changed, but because you have changed how you relate to them. This is not wishful thinking. This is disciplined thinking. It is the practice of choosing, again and again, to direct your mind toward the aspects of a situation that are most likely to help you move forward. And it is one of the most valuable skills you can develop, not just for solving problems, but for living a life that feels more intentional, more engaged, and more resilient. Let us now talk about how to turn this kind of thinking from an occasional effort into a consistent habit. Everything we have discussed so far, the shift toward solution-oriented questions, the management of emotions, the willingness to act despite uncertainty, the practice of reframing, all of it becomes most powerful when it moves from being something you occasionally remember to do into something you consistently practice. In other words, when it becomes a habit. The human mind is, in many ways, a habit machine. It takes patterns that are repeated often enough and automates them, moving them from the effortful domain of conscious thought to the effortless domain of automatic behavior. This is how you learn to drive a car, tie your shoes, or navigate your morning routine without thinking about each step. And it is how you can learn to think in a more solution-oriented way. Not by forcing yourself to think differently every time, but by practicing the new pattern often enough that it begins to run on its own. The first step in building a habit of solution thinking is to create a trigger. A trigger is a cue that reminds you to engage the new pattern. For many people, the most natural trigger is the feeling of being stuck. When you notice that you have been thinking about a problem for an extended period without making progress, when you feel the familiar weight of rumination or the tightness of anxiety, that is your cue. That is the moment to pause and ask yourself a redirecting question. Something as simple as what can I do about this right now, or what is one small step I can take, or what part of this is within my control. The question itself is less important than the act of asking it, because the act of asking a solution-oriented question interrupts the problem-focused loop and opens a new pathway for your thinking. Over time, as you repeat this pattern, feeling stuck, noticing the feeling, asking a redirecting question, something begins to shift. The gap between getting stuck and redirecting shrinks. You catch yourself sooner. You spend less time in the loop, and eventually, the redirecting question starts to arise on its own, without conscious effort. This is the moment when the habit has taken root. It does not mean you will never get stuck again. You will, but the duration and intensity of the stuck periods diminish, and your ability to move through them increases. Another important element of building this habit is reinforcement. When you successfully redirect your thinking and take a productive step, even a small one, it is worth pausing to acknowledge that, not in a grandiose way, not with fanfare or self-congratulation, but with a quiet internal recognition that you just did something useful. This recognition strengthens the neural pathways associated with the new pattern. It makes it more likely that you will repeat the behavior in the future. The brain is remarkably responsive to reinforcement. It moves toward what is rewarded, and by rewarding your own solution-oriented thinking, even with something as simple as a moment of internal acknowledgement, you accelerate the process of habit formation. It is also helpful to create external structures that support the habit. One of the most effective is a daily reflection practice. This does not need to be long or elaborate. It can be as simple as spending 5 minutes at the end of each day asking yourself two questions. What problem did I encounter today, and what did I do, or what could I have done to move toward a solution? This kind of reflection serves multiple purposes. It reinforces the habit of solution-oriented thinking. It helps you identify patterns in your behavior. And it creates a record of progress that you can look back on when you are feeling discouraged. Another supportive structure is the practice of anticipatory planning. This involves looking ahead at the challenges you are likely to face and thinking in advance about how you will respond. If you know you have a difficult meeting tomorrow, spend a few minutes tonight thinking about what outcome you want and what steps might get you there. If you know you are entering a period of financial uncertainty, think about what you can control and what actions might reduce the uncertainty. This kind of proactive thinking is the opposite of worry. Worry imagines bad outcomes and stops there. Anticipatory planning imagines challenges and moves through them to possible responses. It uses the same forward-looking capacity of the mind, but directs it toward solutions rather than fears. There is an important nuance to building this habit that deserves attention. In the early stages, solution-oriented thinking will feel effortful. It will feel unnatural. Your default patterns are strong, and they have had years, sometimes decades, to entrench themselves. There will be moments when you fall back into old patterns, when you ruminate despite knowing it is unproductive, when you catastrophize despite understanding that you are distorting reality. This is normal. It is not evidence that the practice is not working. It is evidence that you are in the process of change, and change is rarely smooth. The key is not to demand perfection from yourself, but to maintain a general direction. If you redirect your thinking more often than you did last week, you are making progress. If you catch yourself ruminating sooner than you used to, you are making progress. Progress is not about doing it perfectly. It is about doing it more. Over time, and this is the part that is hardest to convey, but most important to understand, the cumulative effect of this practice begins to transform not just how you think about individual problems, but how you experience your life as a whole. When solution-oriented thinking becomes your default, you spend less time feeling stuck and more time feeling engaged. You spend less time in anxiety and more time in purposeful action. You spend less time feeling like a victim of your circumstances and more time feeling like an active participant in shaping them. And this shift, this fundamental change in the quality of your inner experience, is worth more than any single solution to any single problem. Because it is not about solving one problem. It is about becoming the kind of person who knows how to approach any problem with clarity, calm, and forward motion. But even as you build this habit, there are mental traps that can pull you off course. Let us look at what those traps are and how to navigate them. There are certain patterns of thinking that are so common and so seductive that nearly everyone falls into them at some point. They are traps precisely because they feel reasonable. They feel like rational responses to difficult situations, but they are not rational. They are habitual, and they are habits that keep you stuck. The first trap is the blame trap. When something goes wrong, there is a powerful pull to assign blame, to point at a person, an institution, a circumstance, and say this is why I am struggling. And sometimes that attribution is accurate. Sometimes someone else did something that caused real harm. Sometimes the system is genuinely unfair. But here is the problem with blame as a primary response. It externalizes your power. When you place responsibility for your situation entirely outside yourself, you also place the power to change it outside yourself. You become dependent on the other person changing, the system being reformed, or the circumstances shifting. And while those things may eventually happen, they are beyond your direct control. In the meantime, you are waiting. And waiting is not a strategy. This does not mean you should never hold others accountable. You should, but accountability and forward motion are not mutually exclusive. You can acknowledge that someone else contributed to the problem and still ask yourself what you can do to move forward. The two are not in conflict. They only become incompatible when blame replaces action entirely. The second trap is the motivation trap. Many people believe they need to feel motivated before they can take action. They wait for inspiration, for energy, for the right mood. And because those feelings are unpredictable and often fleeting, they end up waiting a very long time. The truth is that motivation is not a prerequisite for action. More often, it is a consequence of action. You do not feel like going for a run, but once you start, your energy rises. You do not feel like working on a project, but once you begin, your engagement increases. Action generates the very feelings that people wait for before acting. This is why the most productive and effective people are not necessarily the most motivated. They are the most disciplined. They have learned to act in accordance with their goals rather than their moods. And in doing so, they create the conditions for motivation to emerge naturally. The third trap is the analysis trap. This is the trap of spending so much time analyzing a problem that you never get around to addressing it. It is the endless gathering of information, the perpetual weighing of options, the constant search for more data. Analysis feels productive. It has the appearance of rigor and thoroughness. But when it becomes a substitute for action, it is just another form of avoidance. There is a point at which you have enough information to make a reasonable decision, and once you reach that point, additional analysis does not improve the quality of the decision. It just delays it. Learning to recognize that point and to act when you reach it is a critical skill for anyone who wants to move forward consistently. The fourth trap is the comparison trap. In an age of constant connectivity, it is easy to compare your situation with others and find yourself lacking. Someone else seems to be handling a similar challenge more gracefully. Someone else seems to have found a solution that eludes you. Someone else seems to have avoided the problem entirely. These comparisons are almost always misleading. You are seeing a curated version of someone else's experience, one that omits the struggle, the doubt, the failure. And comparing your behind the scenes experience with someone else's highlight reel is a recipe for discouragement. The solution is not to stop noticing others entirely. That is unrealistic. The solution is to redirect your comparison inward. Compare yourself today with yourself a week ago, a month ago, a year ago. Ask whether you are growing, learning, and moving forward. That is the only comparison that matters. The fifth trap is the perfectionism trap. We touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating because of how pervasive and destructive it is. Perfectionism is the belief that your actions must meet an impossibly high standard before they are worth taking. It paralyzes people in the planning stage, where everything is theoretical and nothing can be criticized. But real progress is messy. It involves mistakes, revisions, and imperfect efforts that gradually improve. If you wait until you can do something perfectly, you will wait forever, and in the process, you will miss the learning that only comes from doing it imperfectly and adjusting. The sixth trap, and in some ways the most insidious, is the identity trap. This is what happens when you begin to define yourself by your problems. When you become the person who is always struggling, always unlucky, always facing obstacles, this identity can feel strangely comfortable. It provides a narrative. It explains your situation. It may even elicit sympathy from others. But it also creates a powerful resistance to change. Because if your problems are who you are, then solving them means losing yourself. And that is a prospect most people will resist, even unconsciously. Breaking free from this trap requires a willingness to update your self-concept. To see yourself not as a person defined by your difficulties, but as a person in the process of navigating them. This is a subtle but profound shift. It moves you from a static identity to a dynamic one, from someone who is stuck to someone who is moving. Awareness of these traps is the first line of defense against them. When you can name a pattern, you gain power over it. When you can recognize that you are blaming, waiting for motivation, overanalyzing, comparing, perfecting, or defining yourself by your problems, you can pause. You can choose differently, not perfectly, not every time, but more often, and that is enough. Because the goal is not to eliminate these patterns entirely. That is unrealistic. The goal is to catch them sooner, interrupt them more often, and redirect your energy toward the things that actually move you forward. With these traps in mind, let us return to a story of someone finding their way forward. Let us see what it looks like when the principles we have discussed begin to take shape in a real life. There was a woman named Alina who, at 37, found herself in a situation she had never anticipated. Her marriage of 12 years ended, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a quiet unraveling that left her feeling more disoriented than she expected. She had 2 children, a modest income from a job she had never particularly loved, and a lease on an apartment that felt too large and too empty at the same time. For the first few months, Alina did what she had always done with problems. She analyzed them. She talked about what had gone wrong with friends who listened patiently. She lay awake at night running through conversations she should have had and decisions she should have made. She felt, in her own words, like she was standing in the ruins of a life she thought she understood. But somewhere around the 4th month, something began to shift. It was not a dramatic moment. It was more like a slow awakening. Alina was sitting at her kitchen table one evening after the kids were asleep, and she realized she had been asking herself the same questions for weeks. What went wrong? Why did this happen? What could I have done differently? And none of these questions were leading anywhere. They were not producing new insight. They were just producing pain. She did not have a framework for what she did next. She had not read books on solution-oriented thinking or studied cognitive psychology. But she did something that was, in its simplicity, the beginning of real change. She took out a piece of paper and wrote at the top a single question. What do I want the next year of my life to look like? It was not an easy question. She did not have a clear answer. But the act of writing it shifted something in her attention. Instead of looking backward at what she had lost, she was looking forward at what she might build. She did not write a grand plan. She wrote small things. She wanted her kids to feel stable. She wanted to feel less anxious. She wanted to save enough money to take them on a trip that summer. She wanted to explore whether a different career might be possible. None of these were solutions to her larger situation. They were starting points. They were small, concrete things she could begin to work toward. And in the days that followed, she began to take small actions. She set up a simple budget. She enrolled in an online course related to a field she had always been curious about. She started having dinner once a week with a friend who made her laugh. Each of these actions was modest. None of them resolved the grief of her marriage ending or the uncertainty of her future. But they gave her something she had not felt in months, a sense of movement. She was no longer standing still, staring at the wreckage. She was walking, slowly and imperfectly, but walking. There were setbacks. There were nights when the old questions returned with full force, when she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was trying to navigate. But she noticed something. Those nights were getting shorter. She was catching herself sooner. When she felt the pull of rumination, she would return to her list, not as a cure, but as a compass, a reminder of the direction she had chosen. Over the course of the next year, Elena's life did not transform into something unrecognizable. She did not become a different person. She became a more focused version of herself. She completed her online course and began exploring opportunities in the new field. She created a small but reliable routine that gave her days a sense of structure. Her children, who had been anxious and unsettled, began to stabilize as they felt their mother's growing steadiness. When Elena looked back on that year, she did not describe it as the year everything got better. She described it as the year she started moving again. And that distinction matters, because the value of solution-oriented thinking is not that it makes everything better. It is that it gets you moving. And once you are moving, things begin to change. Not all at once, not all for the better, but they change. And that change, that evidence that your actions have consequences and your choices have impact, builds the foundation for everything that comes next. Elena's story is not extraordinary. It is, in many ways, ordinary. And that is precisely the point. The shift from problem-focused to solution-focused thinking does not require extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary ability. It requires a willingness to redirect your attention, to ask different questions, to take small steps, and to keep going, even when the path is unclear. We have traveled together through a landscape of ideas, stories, and strategies. We have looked at how the mind works when it encounters difficulty, why it tends to get stuck, and what happens when it learns to redirect its focus. And now, as we come to the close of this time together, it is worth pausing to reflect on what all of this really means. Problems are not going away. That is not a discouraging statement. It is a liberating one, because once you stop expecting a life without problems, You stop being surprised and derailed when they arrive. You stop measuring your success by the absence of difficulty and start measuring it by the quality of your response. And that is a fundamentally different way of living. The people who navigate life most effectively are not the ones who avoid problems. They are the ones who have developed a relationship with problems that allows them to engage without being consumed. They feel the full weight of difficulty, but do not let that weight pin them down. They acknowledge what is hard, but turn their attention to what can be done. They grieve what is lost, but begin to build what comes next. This is not superhuman. It is deeply human. It is the expression of a capacity that exists in every person, the capacity to choose where to direct your mind, even when everything around you is pulling it in the wrong direction. The strategies we have explored, asking better questions, breaking challenges into smaller steps, managing emotions, acting despite uncertainty, reframing how you see situations, building habits of solution thinking, avoiding common mental traps. None of these are complicated. None of them require special training or unusual talent. They require practice. They require patience. And they require a willingness to accept that you will not do any of them perfectly, and that imperfect practice is infinitely more valuable than perfect inaction. There is a quiet power in deciding to face a problem and ask, what can I do about this? It is not a dramatic gesture. It does not make headlines. It does not draw attention or applause. But it is the moment when helplessness begins to transform into agency. It is the moment when the story you are telling yourself shifts from things are happening to me to I am choosing how to respond. And in that shift, however small, lies the seed of every meaningful change you will ever make. Progress is not a straight line. It never has been. It is uneven and sometimes contradictory. There will be days when you feel like you have taken 10 steps forward and days when it feels like 20 steps back. There will be moments of clarity and moments of confusion. There will be breakthroughs that come when you least expect them and setbacks that arrive just when you thought you were free. This is normal. This is what it looks like to be a human being navigating a complex and unpredictable world. The question is not whether you will stumble. The question is whether you will get up and choose a direction. And that direction, more than your circumstances, more than your history, more than the specific nature of the problems you face, is what determines the shape of your life. Not because it guarantees a particular outcome. Nothing can guarantee that. But because it determines how you experience the journey. A person who faces difficulty with their eyes fixed on what can be done experiences that difficulty differently than a person who faces it with their eyes fixed on what went wrong. The external situation may be the same, but the internal experience is profoundly different. And the internal experience is, ultimately, where your life is lived. So as you return to your own life, with its own unique set of challenges and uncertainties, carry this with you. You do not need to have all the answers. You do not need to see the entire path. You do not need to feel confident or certain or ready. You just need to be willing to take the next step, to ask the next question, to make the next small move in the direction of something better. Because progress is rarely about eliminating problems. It is about learning how to move forward despite them, and that ability, that willingness to orient yourself towards solutions, even in the midst of difficulty, is not just a skill. It is a way of being. It is a quiet declaration that no matter what happens, you will not be defined by your problems. You will be defined by how you respond to them. And that shift in thinking, that simple, powerful, endlessly renewable shift, can quietly change everything.